The night Eliza Vane wore her best gown to the Harcastle Assembly Rooms, she heard Lord Ashmore laugh. She did not see his face turn. She did not need to. The sound carried across the width of a doorway, low and unhurried, the kind of laugh a man permits himself when he is among people whose approval costs him nothing, and it reached her at the precise moment she stepped from the cloakroom passage into the light of the ballroom. Miss Vivian Calder's voice followed it, a bright needle of sound threading through the music. That shade of blue, like something a country rector's wife might wear to a christening. Poor creature, she has no one to advise her. A third voice, a woman Eliza did not know, added something softer that dissolved into laughter before she could catch its shape. Eliza did not stop walking. She crossed the threshold with her chin level and her hands loose at her sides, because to stop would have been to confirm what the laugh had already decided. She found a seat near the eastern wall, beside a potted laurel that had shed 3 leaves onto the chair beside it, and she sat down as though she had intended to sit there all along. Her gown was blue. It was the precise shade of a winter sky at 4 in the afternoon, and the seams were felled with stitches so small a magnifying glass would have been required to count them. She had made it herself, in the hour before the workroom opened each morning, over the course of 6 weeks. She did not know, sitting there beside the wilting laurel, that the laugh would eventually cost Lord Henry Ashmore, Earl of Ashmore, a great deal more than he had anticipated. She only knew that it had happened, and that the season had rendered its first verdict on her, and that she had £400 of her brother Thomas's debt still standing between her and any version of her life she might have chosen for herself. The workroom at Madame Paget's establishment on Clarges Street was 12 feet wide by 20 feet long, with a window at the north end that provided light good enough for silk, but insufficient for the finest embroidery after 2 in the afternoon. Eliza had worked there for 11 months. She had arrived the previous spring with a recommendation from the wife of her late father's solicitor, a letter that described her as possessing neat fingers and a quiet temperament, which was accurate enough to be useful without being interesting enough to raise expectations. Mrs. Paget, a brisk, red-haired woman of 40, whose real name was Margaret, but who had adopted the madam with the same practical calculation she applied to all business decisions, had set Eliza to hemming lawn collars for 3 weeks before promoting her to bodice construction, and to bodice construction for a further 5 weeks before admitting, in a tone that suggested she was conceding a point in an argument, that Miss Vane's eye for proportion was better than her own. The debt was Thomas's, contracted at Cambridge before their father's illness had made its severity plain, and it sat at £400 with a creditor named Howell, who held a note that would fall due at the close of the following spring. Thomas was 22 years old, privately educated, and constitutionally unsuited to the desperation his circumstances required. He wrote to Eliza every fortnight from the rooms he let in Holborn, letters that described his efforts to find employment in terms that were eloquent and unconvincing in equal measure. She sent him what she could from her wages. It was not enough to dissolve the debt, but it was enough to keep Howell from writing the second letter that would have been considerably less polite than the first. Their father had left them a small house in Hertfordshire, which the terms of his will permitted Thomas to sell at his majority. Thomas had not yet done so, on the grounds that selling it would feel like the end of something. Eliza had not told him that the thing he was preserving the feeling of had already ended. The Harcastle Assembly was the first ball of the season at which Eliza appeared, and she had gone because Mrs. Paget had suggested it, in the manner she had of suggesting things that were in fact instructions. "You ought to be seen in that gown before you put it aside," she had said, not looking up from the invoices on her desk. "It is too well made to sit in a box." Eliza had understood this to mean, clients who see our craft on a living body commission more than clients who see it on a dressmaker's form. She was not wrong to understand it that way. Mrs. Paget had practical reasons for most of her kindnesses. What Eliza had not anticipated was that the gown, which she knew to be well made, would be judged by the company at the Harkessel Assembly according to criteria that had nothing to do with its construction. Miss Vivian Calder arrived that evening in ivory satin trimmed with Brussels lace, a gown that had cost, Eliza estimated from the weight and drape of the fabric, somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds. The distinction was not the quality of the sewing. The distinction was the name of the woman wearing it, and the names of the women who had gathered around her, and the names she notably lacked. Lord Ashmore stood with Miss Calder's group near the east colonnade, a tall man with light brown hair and a quality of stillness about him that Eliza associated, in the months that followed, with a man who had learned to control the surface of himself at some considerable cost. He did not dance that evening. He stood and spoke in short, level sentences and occasionally permitted his gaze to travel the room with the thoroughness of someone taking an inventory rather than enjoying a party. He was 34 years old. He had been a widower for 2 years, a fact Eliza did not learn until considerably later, and he held his glass with the steady certainty of a man for whom social occasions were obligations rather than pleasures. She did not speak to him that evening. She sat beside her potted laurel and watched the room and went home at 10:30 with the laugh still lodged in some precise location between her sternum and her throat, sharp as a pin left in a finished seam. The workroom on Clarges Street had a small hierarchy of its own, as all workrooms do. At the top of it, in craft if not in years, sat an elderly seamstress named Mrs. Briggs, who had been with Paget's for 14 years, and whose specialty was the kind of intricate cutwork that draped silk into something resembling architecture. Mrs. Briggs was 63 years old, partially deaf in her left ear, and inclined toward silence except when the work demanded otherwise. She had designed a waistcoat panel for a commission the previous autumn, a pattern of interlocking leaves worked in ivory thread on ivory ground, so subtle the design was only legible in raking light, and she had given the sketch to a younger assistant named Clara to transfer to the workroom book, which was how Mrs. Paget kept record of original designs and their makers. Clara had entered the design under her own name. Eliza did not know whether this was carelessness or intention. It did not particularly matter. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning in October, when Mrs. Paget was showing the workroom book to a client who was commissioning a repeat of the pattern, and who addressed her compliments during the showing to Clara. Mrs. Briggs was at the far end of the room, working with her back turned, and gave no sign of having heard. Eliza watched Clara accept the compliment with a small, practiced smile, and then watched Mrs. Paget close the book, and then set down the collar she was hemming, and said, quietly and without particular heat, that she believed the design belonged to Mrs. Briggs, and that if the workroom book recorded otherwise, the recording was an error. The client looked briefly startled. Mrs. Paget looked at Eliza with an expression that held several things at once: irritation at the disruption, acknowledgement that the disruption was correct, and a considering quality that Eliza recognized as reappraisal. Clara flushed to the roots of her hair. The correction was made. The workroom book was amended. Mrs. Briggs did not turn around, but the set of her shoulders changed in a way that Eliza noticed. It was a small thing, and it cost Eliza nothing beyond the moment's discomfort, and she gave it very little further thought. She returned to her hemming, and the morning continued. Lord Ashmore came to Paget's on the 3rd Thursday of November. He arrived at 11 o'clock, accompanied by a man of business named Mr. Jenks, who did the talking while the Earl stood slightly behind him, and to the left, examining a roll of black crepe with the detached attention of someone who had not come to be charmed, but to acquire a specific thing. The commission was for morning dress, 2 gowns, a pelisse, and a set of covered buttons in jet, for purposes he did not explain and that Mrs. Paget did not ask about, because a client of his rank supplied the information a modiste required, and nothing beyond it. Eliza was at the fitting table when they arrived, pinning a sleeve to a bodice for another commission. She did not stop working. She heard Mrs. Paget greet him, and she heard the low, even cadences of his voice, confirming specifications. And she was aware, in the particular way one is aware of a change in the temperature of a room, that he was now standing somewhat closer than before. He did not recognize her. There was no reason he should have. She had been a figure near a wall at a ballroom he had attended while paying attention to other things, and she looked different here, with a workroom apron over her dress and a pincushion strapped to her wrist. He did not address her directly. He said at one point to Mrs. Paget that the pelisse ought to allow for a full sleeve rather than the narrow current fashion, and that he wanted the covered buttons to extend to the wrist rather than stopping at the elbow, and Mrs. Paget said she would note that, and turned to find Eliza already writing it down. He noticed her hands, she thought. She did not know why she thought so. His gaze moved across the table for a moment, and she had the distinct and slightly unreasonable impression that it stopped on her fingers where they held the pencil, and then continued. She finished writing and did not look up, and he left with Mr. Jenks 9 minutes later. The commission was for morning items to complete an order that had been placed 2 years prior and never fulfilled. Mrs. Paget told her this the following morning, setting the original order sheet beside the new instructions with a look of mild professional sympathy. The original commission, dated from the spring of the year before last, had been for a lady's complete morning wardrobe. It had been placed by the late Countess's own maid and had been nearly finished when a second letter arrived, requesting that the work stop. The maid's letter had not explained why. Mrs. Paget had placed the incomplete work in a cedar chest and billed for what was done, and the cedar chest had sat in the storeroom for 2 years until the Earl's man arrived with new instructions and a request that the commission be completed as specified. Eliza read the original order sheet. It had been signed by a woman named Catherine. She set the paper down and went back to her work. She was there 3 weeks later when he returned to check the progress of the commission, and it was during this visit, on a gray Wednesday afternoon in early December, that the matter of the provenance label occurred. A buyer named Mr. Cathcart had been in the shop the previous hour, examining a gown that had been commissioned, completed, and then not collected by a client who had moved to Edinburgh without settling her account. It was a fine piece, pale green silk with a collar of Honiton lace, and Cathcart had made an offer for it that was fair, but that came attached to a request. He wished the workroom label inside the gown to be replaced with one from a more fashionable establishment, a dressmaker on Bond Street whose name carried a premium he could collect when he sold it on. He offered Eliza an additional 2 shillings to make the substitution, while Mrs. Paget was otherwise occupied. 2 shillings was not insignificant to a woman earning what Eliza earned. She told him no. She said it without elaboration, and without looking away from him, which she suspected made the refusal more uncomfortable than he had anticipated. Cathcart left with the gown still on the rail, and an expression of mild affront that she found she could bear without difficulty. She did not know that the Earl had come in from the rear passage while Cathcart was still speaking, and that he had stood just inside the workroom door for the duration of the exchange, and that he had heard every word of it. She learned this later. At the time, she only turned back to the morning commission, which was progressing exactly as planned, and heard Mrs. Paget's voice from the front of the shop, greeting the Earl's arrival in the brisk professional tone she reserved for clients she respected. He stayed for 20 minutes, He examined the completed pelisse and the buttons and said they were correct. He looked, once, at the uncollected gown still hanging on the rail where Cathcart had left it. And then he looked at Eliza. And then he returned his attention to Mrs. Paget and asked whether the gown commission would be ready before Christmas. Mrs. Paget said it would. He said thank you, which was the kind of thing men of his rank sometimes said when they meant to be remembered as courteous, and he left. Eliza pressed the jet buttons and thought about Catherine's handwriting on the original order sheet, which had been precise and slightly angular, and wondered what kind of woman placed an order for her own mourning dress. The question was not rhetorical. The commission Mrs. Paget had reconstructed from the original instructions told a specific story. Catherine, Countess of Ashmore, had placed the order herself in the spring 2 years past, during what must have been an illness she understood to be fatal. She had specified the fabrics, the cut, the buttons, the trimming. She had written in the margins of the order sheet, in the same angular hand, a note requesting that the pelisse be cut slightly longer than the current fashion, as she was tall and preferred the proportion. She had never received it. She had died, Mrs. Paget had mentioned once, in late April of that year, 3 weeks after the maid's letter requesting the work stop. The reason the work had been stopped was because it was no longer needed. Eliza understood this sitting at the workroom table, with the completed pelisse across her lap and the jet buttons in a paper twist beside it. And she felt something shift in her understanding of the man who had stood in the doorway on a gray Wednesday afternoon. His coldness was not a natural condition. It was something built over something else, laid down like a floor over a cellar. And the cellar held a specific grief that had arrived in the form of a garment ordered by someone who had known she was dying. She was still thinking about this when Lady Dorothea Ashmore came to Paget's 2 days before Christmas. The Dowager Countess was a woman of 60, with fine gray hair and a posture that conveyed, without apparent effort, that she had been the most important person in every room she had entered for the past 40 years and did not expect that to change. She had the kind of face that age has sharpened rather than softened, with dark eyes that moved over a room the way a surveyor moves over a property, assessing, categorizing, noting what required attention. She came ostensibly to collect a set of evening gloves she had ordered in November. She stayed 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, she walked slowly through the front workroom, examining the pieces displayed on the forms, while Eliza worked at the table and Mrs. Paget attended to the transaction at the front desk. Dorothea did not speak to Eliza directly. She spoke about Eliza in a carrying tone addressed to Mrs. Paget, noting that she had heard that Pagets now employed some of the season's more unfortunate young women who had found themselves obliged to enter trade, and that while she appreciated the charity of it, she did hope the establishment maintained the level of discretion that had always recommended it to families of standing, as it would not do to find oneself, arriving for a fitting, in a room with someone one had last seen attempting to pass for a debutante at the Harcastle Assembly. Mrs. Paget said something non-committal that Eliza did not catch. Dorothea collected her gloves and left. The bell above the door rang twice as it swung shut. Mrs. Paget stood at the front of the shop for a moment after the sound died, with her back to the workroom, and then she came to the table and began sorting through the order slips in a manner that had nothing to do with their actual order. "She is one of 6 patrons whose continued custom represents 1/3 of my winter accounts," she said, not looking up from the slips. Eliza set down the work in her hands. "I know," she said. "She will not return if you are here. She will tell 4 other women of similar standing that she will not return, and 2 of the 4 will follow her." "I know," Eliza said again. Mrs. Paget looked up then, with an expression that held the same several things it had held in October when the workroom book had been corrected. Irritation, acknowledgement, and now something that looked like regret, which was new. It is not a permanent situation. The season ends in May. If you were to take a leave of absence for the remainder of the winter, I could bring you back in the spring with a different circumstance to explain your re-engagement. She meant it as a kindness. Eliza recognized it as one, and also recognized that it accomplished the same thing as a dismissal in every practical respect. She went home that evening to her rented rooms in a house on Thayer Street, where the landlady was tolerant and the windows faced north. And she wrote 2 letters. The first was to Thomas, telling him that her situation at Paget's had altered and that he should not expect a contribution for the following month. The second was to Mrs. Paget, thanking her for 11 months of employment and confirming that she would not be returning in any capacity. She had made her decision on the walk home, in the cold, with her breath visible in the lamplight. She was not going to conduct herself as something temporary that required explaining. If she left, she would leave cleanly. In the morning she received a note from Thomas, crossed with her own in the post, informing her that Howell's man had called that week and left a letter. The note in Howell's second letter was clear. The £400 was due by the end of January, not the end of spring. The terms had been miscalculated, Thomas wrote, or misstated, or perhaps he had misread them. He was not entirely certain. Either way, January was 6 weeks away. Eliza read this twice, and then sat very still for a moment, looking at the north-facing window, where the sky outside was the color of unbleached linen. She thought about the mourning commission. It was complete. She had finished the last piece, a set of covered buttons, on the morning before Dorothea's visit. The commission sat at Paget's in the cedar chest, ready for collection, attributed to the establishment, bearing no individual maker's mark because individual seamstresses at Paget's did not sign their work. The Earl expected to collect it before the new year. There was no practical reason for Eliza to deliver it herself. There was no practical reason not to, either. She had made it. Every stitch of it was hers. She wrote a note to Mrs. Paget stating that she would collect the Ashmore commission and deliver it personally, as she had intimate knowledge of every piece and could answer any questions the client had about construction or care. Mrs. Paget, she knew, would understand this as the assertive professional act it was intended to appear. She was not certain she was wrong to hope it might also be something else, something more closely related to the specific quality of the late Countess's handwriting in the margins of an order sheet, and a gown that had been made for a woman who died before she could wear it. She arrived at Ashmore House on a Wednesday morning in the last week of December, with the cedar chest carried between herself and a Paget's delivery boy named Sam, who was 13 years old and largely indifferent to the aristocracy. A footman received them at the side door and led them to a corridor off the ground floor, and then, after a wait of approximately 10 minutes, to a study at the back of the house where the Earl was standing behind a desk with a letter in his hand and the slightly arrested expression of someone who has just been surprised by something he does not yet know how to categorize. He recognized her then. She could see it happen. His gaze moved over her face with the specific stillness of recollection. And then he set the letter down. "Miss Vane," he said. "I was told a delivery had arrived." "The commission is complete, Your Grace," she said. "I wish to ensure it reached you correctly." He looked at the cedar chest and then back at her, and she saw something pass across his face that was not quite an expression, more the trace of one, like the impression a seal leaves in wax a moment after being lifted. "You made these pieces," he said. It was not precisely a question. "Every piece, Your Grace. If you wish to verify the specifications against the original order, I have the sheet with me." He did not ask for the sheet. He asked her to sit down, which she had not expected. And she sat, because to refuse would have been absurd. And he stood for a moment, looking at the chest, and then sat down himself. He did not open the chest immediately. He said, after a pause that had a particular quality to it, "The original commission was placed by my wife." "I know," Eliza said. He looked at her. A quantity of silence gathered in the room. "She ordered it herself," he said. "I did not know until after she was gone. I found the original order sheet among her papers, and I wrote to cancel it, and then I wrote again to complete it, and then I did nothing with it for 2 years. He paused. "I am not certain why I finally completed the commission." Eliza thought she might be. She did not say so. "The police is cut as she specified," she said instead, carefully. "The longer proportion. I followed her notes exactly." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he opened the chest and lifted the police out, and she watched him hold it for a moment, without moving. With his hands still and his face very controlled, and the weight of the garment carried in his arms with a care she recognized, because it was the same care with which a piece of work is handled when it is the only one of its kind, and cannot be replaced. His jaw was set. There was a brightness at the edge of his eyes that he did not permit to become anything further. He placed it down on the edge of the desk, with great deliberateness, and said, "Thank you, Miss Vane. It is exactly as it should have been." She left Ashmore House with the empty cedar chest and Sam trailing behind her, and she walked back toward Thayer Street in the gray winter light and thought about a great many things, none of which she was prepared to name with any precision. If you have found yourself leaning into this story, you are very welcome to leave a comment with your own thoughts on what Eliza chose to do next. The subscription bell will ensure you do not miss the moments that are still to come. The second ball of the season was held at Harcastle on the 14th of January, which was a Friday. Eliza had not intended to attend. Her situation had changed materially since the first ball. She was no longer employed. Thomas's creditor had moved his deadline to the end of the month, and the price of a ticket to a public assembly was a figure she ought to have been calculating more carefully than she was. She attended because Mrs. Briggs, who had retired from Paget's the previous month and now sat in rooms in Pimlico, with her hands finally free to do as they liked, sent her a note saying that a ticket had been left for her at the Harcastle door under her name, and that Mrs. Briggs would be gratified if she used it, and that the blue gown was wasted in a box. She wore it. She had not altered it since the first ball, and it fit exactly as it had before, with the seams felled to their invisible line and the skirt falling in the precise relationship to the floor she had calculated 6 weeks and 2 lives ago. She arrived at Harcastle at 8 in the evening and accepted a glass of negus from a passing footman and stood near the eastern wall, which she recognized, and thought that this was perhaps not a very different version of the first evening after all. Miss Vivian Calder was present, in rose silk this time, accompanied by a young baronet who had the look of a man congratulating himself on his own good taste. Lady Dorothea Ashmore was present, seated near the windows in the company of 2 women of approximately her own decade, with a fan held at the height that indicated she was observing rather than participating. Lord Ashmore arrived at 8:30. He came without his man of business this time, alone and dark-coated, and he moved through the room with the contained deliberateness she had observed before, pausing to speak with 3 or 4 acquaintances in the short level sentences that appeared to be his primary conversational register. He did not dance. He had not danced at the first ball either. He found her 20 minutes after he arrived. She became aware of him approaching from her left, crossing the room with a directness that caused 2 conversations to pause, and 1 woman to turn and then turn again. And he stopped a few feet from her and said, In the level voice she had come to associate with things he meant precisely. "Miss Vane." "My lord," she said, because she was not prepared to perform a surprise she did not feel. "I have been looking for you," he said. "I have been here," she replied, which was both accurate and insufficient, and they both knew it. He looked at her gown. He looked at it in the way he had looked at the police in his study, with a specific attention she recognized as the attention of someone who understands what they are seeing. Then he looked at her face. "You made this gown," he said. She held his gaze. "I did." He turned without further preamble and looked at the room. Miss Calder was approximately 12 feet away, the baronet at her side, and Lady Dorothea was still seated near the windows, her fan moving slowly, and the general crowd of the Harcastle Assembly was distributed around them in its various occupations, and the music was between pieces, and the room was momentarily quieter than it had been. In that quiet, the Earl of Ashmore said, in a voice neither elevated nor lowered, carrying the clear authority of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to disguise the decision, "I should like the room to know that the gown Miss Vane is wearing this evening was made by her own hands, and that the craft in it is as fine as anything I have seen produced in London this season." The room heard it. The music had not yet resumed, and the room was small enough, and the Earl's voice was the kind of voice that carried without effort, and every person within 20 feet heard it clearly. And the silence that followed had the particular quality of a verdict being reread by the jury that delivered it. Miss Calder turned. Something moved in her expression, a rapid recalculation. Her confidence of 3 months ago meeting the concrete fact of the Earl's attention directed not at her and not at her gown, but at the woman from the eastern wall in the blue dress. The baronet beside her said something under his breath. Vivian did not respond to him. Lady Dorothea's fan stopped moving. Eliza became very aware of her own hands, which were still at her sides. She kept them there. He had not finished. He said, still in that level, unhurried tone, "I also know that the maker of this gown refused a 2-shilling bribe to misattribute another woman's work, and that she completed a commission of considerable personal significance to me with a precision and a care that I did not have the capacity to ask for, and that she offered without being asked." He paused. "I intend to offer Miss Vane the freedom to decline the question I am about to put to her, in whatever manner she finds most appropriate." The room was very quiet. "Miss Vane," he said, turning back to her, and his voice dropped slightly, still audible but addressed now to her rather than the room. "I should like very much to call on you, with a purpose that is not ambiguous, and with every practicality already resolved to my satisfaction, if you will permit me." She looked at him. The quality of his stillness at that moment was different from any she had previously observed. It was not the stillness of discipline, or the stillness of a man containing something difficult. It was the stillness of a man who had said exactly what he meant, and had no more to add, and would wait as long as was required. She said, "I permit you, Your Grace." It was not a declaration. It was not a flourish. It was the precise truth of what she felt in that moment, measured and deliberate and offered without performance. And the room heard the shape of it, if not every word. And she held his gaze for a moment, and then looked away, because there was only so much a person could absorb at one time. Lady Dorothea rose from her chair near the windows. Her companion reached for her arm, but Dorothea did not require steadying. She was too composed for anything as visible as unsteadiness. What she did was stand very straight and look at the Earl across the room with the expression of someone who has understood, fully and completely, that the thing she has been preventing has now occurred in the most public possible location, and who knows that she cannot unsay it, or undo it, or reconvene the verdict. Her fan was closed in her hand. After a moment, with a dignity that Eliza found she genuinely respected, the dowager inclined her head by approximately 5 degrees and turned and walked toward the door, unhurried, as though she had always intended to leave at this precise moment. Vivian Calder watched her go. Then she looked once more at Eliza, at the blue gown, at the seams and the cut and the fall of the skirt that she had assessed 3 months ago as something a country rector's wife might wear to a christening, and the assessment visibly revised itself in her expression into something less comfortable and more honest. She did not speak. She turned back to the baronet and said something that required her whole attention, and she was still turned away when the music resumed. Thomas's creditor Howell received a bank draft for £400 on the 18th of January, drawn on an account Eliza did not fully understand the provenance of, until the Earl explained it to her 3 days later, in the sitting room of his house in Grosvenor Square, over tea that neither of them drank while it was still warm. He had engaged a solicitor to review the terms of the note, and had found, upon examination, that the recalculation of the due date had been conducted with a looseness that the note's original language did not support. He had cleared the debt before raising the matter with Eliza, because he had not wanted the resolution to function as leverage, which she understood, and would have objected to had he conducted it differently. She did not object. She said, "You should have told me." He said, "I have told you now." She thought about this, and about the police folded in the cedar chest, and about a woman ordering her own mourning clothes in angular handwriting, and about a workroom table on a gray December morning, and she said, "Your wife was a precise woman." He was quiet for a moment. "She was," he said. "She did not expect to be grieved as she was." "Neither did you, I imagine," Eliza said. "Expect to grieve as you did." It was the kind of honest thing she could not have said 3 months ago, and she said it not as a consolation but as an acknowledgment, which was different, and he received it as such, with a brief slight change in his face that was not quite an expression, and that she had learned, by then, to read accurately. They were married in March, by a special license, in a small church in Hertfordshire, near the house Thomas had not yet sold, and now would not need to. Mrs. Briggs came, and Mrs. and Paget came, and Sam the delivery boy was deemed too young for a church service, but was given a coin of sufficient size to produce a memorable argument about his exclusion. Thomas stood at his sister's side in a coat that fit him for the first time in 2 years, and wore the expression of a man who has been delivered from a difficulty he was not fully adequate to solve for himself, which was accurate, and which Eliza forgave him entirely because she loved him, and because his inadequacy was at least accompanied by gratitude. Dorothea did not attend. She sent a letter of formal congratulations written in the careful language of someone who has reconsidered her position and wishes to occupy the new situation with as much composure as the old one. Eliza read it twice and wrote back with equal care, because the dowager's confidence had been constructed from real materials, even if it had been applied incorrectly, and there was nothing to gain from cruelty where a simple peace was available. The following spring was mild and early. Eliza had a workroom at Ashmore's estate in Wiltshire, on the ground floor at the back of the house, with a window that faced the south garden and admitted a quality of light that was useful for fine work at all hours. It was not the Clarges Street workroom, which had been 12 feet wide and smelled of sizing and the particular damp of London winters. It was larger and quieter and entirely her own. She had brought a few pieces of equipment from the old workroom, including a pincushion that Mrs. Briggs had given her on her last day at Paget's, worked in red and yellow silk in a pattern that was entirely impractical and entirely beautiful. Thomas had come down to Wiltshire for a fortnight in February and had sat in the workroom doorway for an entire afternoon, watching Eliza work, in the companionable silence that had always been their most comfortable mode of being in the same room together. He was reading for the bar now, in a chambers Eliza did not inquire too closely about the provenance of, and he looked better than he had in 3 years. He had the beginnings of a career, and the complete absence of a debt, and the slightly dazed expression of someone who has passed through a period of considerable difficulty and emerged to find the landscape altered in every direction. The evening before he left, sitting by the fire in the long drawing room with the light going blue and cold outside the windows, he said, "The dress was very good, you know. Even I could see it." She said, "You cannot see it. You are entirely unqualified." He said, "I saw that it was good." She looked at the fire for a moment, at the coals arranged in the careful arrangement that the house's experienced great man managed every evening, and she thought about the Harcastle Assembly and the eastern wall and the potted laurel and the 3 shed leaves on the chair beside her, and the laugh that had crossed a ballroom and found her in a doorway, and all the months that had lived between that sound and this firelit room. "It was very good," she agreed. The Earl came in from the corridor a few minutes later, with the evening air still on his coat, and a letter in his hand that turned out to be of no immediate consequence, and he sat down in the chair at the far end of the hearth, and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things about him she had come to love without intending to. The way his silence was occupied and warm rather than empty. Thomas fell asleep in his chair, as he always had since childhood, with his chin dropping and his breathing slowing, and the book he had been reading tipping sideways in his loosening fingers. Eliza got up and took the book before it fell, and set it on the table beside him, and went to the south-facing window at the end of the room, and looked out at the garden in the last of the evening light. The window glass was slightly wavy in the old way, and the garden beyond it was simplified by the dusk, and she could see, if she turned her head at a certain angle, the faint reflection of the room behind her. The fire, the 2 chairs, the sleeping man, the Earl's still profile at the end of the hearth. The pincushion from Mrs. Briggs sat on the workroom table 1 floor below, where she had left it that morning. She could not see it from here. She knew exactly where it was. She stayed at the window a little longer, and outside, the first light snow of the season began to fall against the glass, quiet and unhurried, and the garden received it without any particular ceremony. The way ground receives what has always been coming. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest, and press the bell so you are here for the next one.